Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Juan Betancourt, thank you so much for joining us as our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your schedule to do this. I'm so excited about our time together. Like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. So with your permission, we're going to start with where you were born and go all the way up to today, and then we can talk about all the amazing stuff that you're working on for today and or tomorrow, okay?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Appreciate you being here, buddy. So where were you born?
Fairfax, Virginia, right outside of D.C.
There you go. I know where Fairfax, Virginia is. So did you grow up in Fairfax?
Grew up on the other side of the border in Maryland, in a place called Silver Spring.
Okay.
And so my father was a professor at the University of Maryland, teaching economics. And my mother, her family, they're both Cuban. So they left during the Cuban Revolution, and her entire family settled at a place called Lake Barcroft, a really beautiful place in Seven Corners, Virginia, where Fairfax is.
Okay. So what was your favorite thing about growing up there?
We lived on a dead-end street, 8 houses, no cars coming down, and every house had dogs and kids. And so it was just kind of, what was that movie, The Goonies?
Yeah.
You know, just kids playing around in the park. There's a backyard with horses and then a forest, and we could go for hours, and it was all trees. And at the same time, though, we were, 30 minutes from the nation's capital. So it was kind of a metropolitan-esque area, but we kind of felt like it was in the country. It was great.
Almost like an oasis right in the middle of all that.
It was an oasis, and a very diverse group of people. The street had probably 8 houses and like 8 nationalities.
Wow, that's cool. That is so cool. So you played outside until it was time, until it was dark, right? It was time to come in for dinner.
Yeah, I'm at an age where we did not have mobile phones or smartphones or digital anything.
Yeah, me either.
So this was, skipping rocks in the creek, catching fireflies, playing basketball, one of the neighbors' homes, counting rocks for hours at end. It was, my kids probably would find it boring now, but it was just pure innocence. It was great. We really focused on
trade it for anything.
I wouldn't trade it for anything. I actually wish I could create the same environment for my children, but I think it's impossible.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah.
That's what I told my kids. I said, listen, the way I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, and I farmed for 9 years with my grandfather. And I told my kids, I said, if I had a time machine and I could control this, you'd go back and work for granddad. You'd go back and you'd grow up exactly the way I did. Because there's no way I would trade it for anything. It was the most unbelievable way to grow up. And it was simple. There was no internet. There was no smartphones. There was no any of the stuff that you have today, right? You were outside and you were working, and the beautiful thing about it was when you farm for 9 years, everything after that feels like you're playing hooky.
It's easy, right?
Because it's all easier. Everything else is easier than that. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Even relationships. We live in a neighborhood that's structurally like the one I was in Maryland here in Miami, where I am now. But, people are so busy now these days, and neighbors don't really get to know each other. Whereas when I grew up on a dead-end street, like I was going and saying prayer in the morning at my neighbor's house with their family for breakfast, just because their daughter and I would walk to school together. Like, oh, why don't you just come every morning at 6 and have breakfast and say prayer with us? So, I mean, I grew up inside the kitchens and living rooms of my neighbors, talking with adults as a 5-year-old, right? Like I don't see 5, 7, 10, 15-year-olds talking with their neighbors' parents, if that.
Yeah.
So,
Have you ever read the Popcorn Report?
No, I like the name of it, but
You ever get a chance, read it. It's written by a lady by the name of Faith Popcorn. And she talks about, this is written back in the 90s, mind you. Okay. So a long time ago. Not a long time ago now, right? But she was talking about a thing called cocooning. And we as human beings in the United States are closing off, right? So years ago, builders would build homes in the 50s and 60s
Yeah.
that had big, large porches out front. And if it didn't have a big, large porch that sometimes wrapped around where you could sit on the porch and you could interact with your neighbors and sit on a rocking chair and solve all the world's problems and all that kind of thing, you couldn't sell the house if it didn't have those things. Today, you can't sell a house with a front porch, right? Everybody wants what's in the back, right? And we're building bigger walls and we're closing off, and we come home and we open the garage door and we pull in and we close the garage door and we never see our neighbors. We never get to know them. That's a problem. That's a problem. Okay. But anyway, it's the Popcorn Report. It's a great book. Anyway, so where'd you go to high school?
So I went to a place called Springbrook High School.
Okay.
Public school. 4A, it's the largest size high school, about 2,000 students or 2,400. So we have about 600-700 per class, if not.
Your graduating class, yeah.
Yeah.
So did you have a favorite subject in high school?
Everything. I was the most curious person you could imagine. So I dug into every subject, whether it was home economics and typing to AP calculus as a sophomore. I took 6 AP classes for college course credit by sophomore year. I mean, I was, I ended up being valedictorian in my class.
That's awesome.
So, I mean, I never touched a cigarette or did drugs or drank alcohol during high school. My parents were Cuban, so we had this tradition of, maybe a story, which as a young kid you hear as a tradition, but we're the smartest people in the world. We're the most successful people in the world. Our country was the best ever. We're in exile. We've lost it all. It's now up to you, young man and young children, to get back what we lost. Kind of like what the Jews have been able to instill in their youth. Like let's reclaim what was taken from us. And so I drank the Cuban Kool-Aid, and man, all I did was work, study, and play sports to get, the best I could be physically. I played soccer for the U.S. national team. I ran a 406 mile. I think I was the third fastest kid in the entire country. And when I say kid, third fastest person, not kid, including adults. And I played basketball for the 9th best basketball team in the country. And I was the only white person on a team of 18 black players. So, I mean, I just excelled at everything. I liked everything. I excelled at everything. Now, that's not the case today. I realized that you do actually like some things more than others. It took me like 20 years to realize that.
Well, it's interesting, the standards that your parents give you, right? That's a big parenting lesson for people, right? The kids will rise to your standards. You're living proof of it.
It is the biggest problem with other ethnic groups in this country that don't have that. I won't say which ones, but there is a challenge today where some people play the victim and some people play, we're great, which, they're two extremes. But I think every parent should set the goal and standard as you can be anything, you're the best. And I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, I totally agree. So after high school, where'd you go?
So I went to Harvard for college, played soccer there all 4 years, majored in economics. They didn't have business, so it was the closest thing to economics. And froze my butt off up in Boston.
There you go. So you graduate from Harvard. Were you the valedictorian there too?
No, it's weird. Harvard has 1,600 students every year, and probably 90% were valedictorian or salutatorian. So it's a real, a lot of people get sad or depressed because they've been number one and the best and the smartest for as far as they can remember from the age of, let's say, 12 to 18. And now they're with all really smart people who were smarter than them. And as great as you thought you were, you're just average. And to come into Harvard and become average, it's a punch in the face. So
adjustment,
So I was lucky because even though academically I felt very average very quickly, I was still the best in the country at soccer. And so I was still on the front page of the Harvard Crimson because I was leading scorer as a freshman, and we were top 10 in the country every year. So, I was a big deal, and I had the confidence still because I was like, okay, well, I'm good at one thing.
Yeah, here we go.
They can't take that away from me.
That's
So,
right.
yeah.
That's cool, man. So you leave Harvard, you graduate from Harvard. Where do you go from there?
So the theme of Cuban, I'll be mentioning it. My whole life, I wanted to go back to Cuba because my family were some of the earliest settlers in Cuba and some of the first
Okay.
presidents, and they kind of ran the country for a long time. And in Latin America, when a family is like a founding family,
Mhm.
um, there's a lot of benefits to that.
It's a
And
legacy. Yeah.
it's a legacy. And so my whole childhood up until 22, I thought I was living in exile, waiting to go back to Cuba because no
Right.
Cubans came to the U.S. to stay. It was
Right.
like a step down for them. There's a statistic that most people don't know, but before communism, before 1959, there's not one documented case of a person leaving Cuba illegally to the U.S. Think about that. So if you were
Really?
poor, middle class, or rich, there's no way in hell you would go on that fisherman's boat and go 90 miles for 3 hours
I
because
didn't
what
know that.
awaited you on the US is gonna be a lot worse than what you had in Cuba.
I didn't know
People,
that.
that's the most powerful statistic you should know, or anybody should know about Cuba. It had trains 10 years before the US had trains. It had air conditioning for the US. It was the best place in the hemisphere to live from 1508 to 1905. And between 1905 and 1959, it was equally as amazing as to live in the US. And so my whole goal was to get educated and go back to Cuba and get back what was lost or taken from us. However, Cuba wasn't open in 1993 when I graduated, and
Yeah.
so there was a company, but Russia had just dropped them from giving them billions of dollars of economic aid. So their GDP per capita went from like $1,000 per person down to 60. So abject poverty. Like they
Oh,
went from Dominican Republic to Haiti level
yeah.
of, and so everyone thought, oh, Cuba's going to break. Now's the time to go. And so Procter and Gamble, a really well-known company,
Mhm.
who used to, all the US companies had their headquarters in Cuba before. So a lot of them were starting to announce, oh, we're going to go back to Cuba. And so
Right.
Procter and Gamble had moved their headquarters to Puerto Rico in those 50 years. And they announced, we're going to go to Cuba now that it's going to open. So I hightailed, turned down jobs in investment banking and consulting in the US to go to live and work in Puerto Rico with Procter and Gamble,
Mhm.
hoping that Cuba would open up in the next 3 or 4 years and I'd have a job in this great country that I was going to go help rebuild.
Gotcha.
So
Okay. So you were on
Procter
a
and Gamble in Puerto
mission.
Rico. I was on a mission at that point,
Yeah.
to go help rebuild Cuba, and that really was kind of my long-term plan up until 22, and then those 4 years in Puerto Rico, um, I guess I just became wise or more practical and realized that 4 years of making no money, the Cuban people were just so kept down that nothing was going to change, and I realized I couldn't wait my entire life to go and have a life and wait for Cuba to open. So that's when I threw in the towel and gave up the dream of Cuba at the age of 26.
Gotcha. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask anyway. Who was the most influential person to you growing up?
Oh gosh, I learned from so many mentors in life. I think there's four. I mean, it's hard to separate. They're
It's
all,
okay. That's okay.
so
It doesn't
my,
have to be one.
yeah,
It can be more than one.
yeah. So my my parents, I mean, I to this day they're my best friends. I respect them. I model my life, everything I do after them, my values. Um, I they were my blueprint for 80% of everything I did that was family or value based and even education. And then there was my high school teacher who was also my soccer coach. This is a guy who was on the cover of Sports Illustrated for soccer. He had taken Trinidad and Tobago, all their players when he was in high school,
Mhm.
to Howard University, and they became the most winning soccer team in the history of the US. More
Wow.
goals, more wins, 4 years, champions every year. Turns out they got stripped of a lot of that because supposedly one player was older, but a lot of their ESPN just did a movie on it with Spike Lee on 30, under 30, another one called Redemption. So
Uh-huh.
this guy named Ian Bain, he was my teacher, my coach, my mentor. Just saw him now, 35 years later, this a couple months ago.
Wow.
He was great because he was just so inspirational for me to be an athlete. He treated me like a man when I was in high school, got me, I was an upper middle class kid by the time I was in high school, and that doesn't make it in the pros, right? And
Yeah.
so, he had me train with Jamaicans, and he's like, look, these guys hate you. They hate white people. This group of them that you're playing with, they're going to try to break your leg.
Mhm.
They don't, it's not personal, but I want you to touch that ball and already know what you're going to do with it. Because if you hold it for a second, which most kids do, they hold it too long, you'll get your leg broken in Europe or Latin America or Caribbean.
Right.
So he was instrumental for just learning about life and becoming an adult and responsibility and staying focused in soccer and just what he taught me in soccer. And then the last person would be my grandfather. He's actually the inventor of modern day plastic surgery. So in Cuba, he used to graft pigs and learned that skin of pigs and skin of humans are similar.
Hmm.
And so he figured out for the first time ever that if you cut in a straight line, it scars. Well, we all know that. But if
Mhm.
you cut in a Z or a W,
Mhm.
it looks like Frankenstein for the first 2 months.
Mhm.
But if you cut it that way, it cuts along the lines of the cells, so there's no scarring. And so today, every plastic surgeon in the world follows my grandfather, Alberto Facundo Borges's technique of how to do plastic surgery. He's in every medical book in the world, in the US, everywhere. And he's
Oh,
the founder of all modern day plastic surgery. And he worked his butt off. And
yeah.
he was a world-class crew rower. He
Mhm.
would row every day. We'd go to his house. He was also that patriarch. He'd have 150 family members at the house every weekend on the lake, and somehow he made everyone feel like they were his favorite grandson and cousin. And he was just one of those people that they just don't come along very often.
Yeah.
Brilliant man, loving man, family man, and an innovator, right?
Yeah.
To be the pioneer of one of the 20 practices of medicine and be the most advanced person in the history of that.
Yeah.
Where now everybody follows your techniques. It's called W-plasty and Z-plasty after him.
Wow.
Those are the four
Wow.
probably. Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. That is so cool. You have such a legacy. I just love this. So
Well, it's
let
pure luck because I was born into all
oh,
of
I
that.
know.
So
I know you didn't choose
people
them,
say
but
they
my
do it all
goodness.
themselves. I don't believe
Yeah.
like
Well, but
80% of mine was
to
lucky
your
to be in the right place at the right time.
I understand, but to your credit, you took this legacy and you embraced it. You took this mission and you embraced it,
Right.
and you made it your life. Some people don't, right?
This is true.
Some people go the opposite way. So this is a real credit to you that you took this on your shoulders. There's some stress here, right? You took this on your shoulders and you went to work, which is what your family does, right? Your family's hardworking,
Yep.
they believe in doing the right thing, and I love this. So you leave Harvard. You're now in the workforce, right?
Yep.
So you're at Procter and Gamble in Puerto Rico, right? Sort of waiting for Cuba to open back up. Then what happens?
So when I realized that Cuba wasn't going to open, I thought, okay, what are you going to do with your life? And so I transferred with Procter & Gamble to Cincinnati just to get back to the US. And all along, a plan B was if Cuba were not to open, Procter & Gamble had the highest acceptance rate to Harvard Business School.
Okay.
And so it was Procter & Gamble, McKinsey, and Goldman Sachs. This is back in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And so I knew that I'd be applying to business school. And at that point, you had to spend 3 or 4 years outside working from college before you could apply. So I went to Cincinnati knowing I'd probably apply with a couple of years, but went to headquarters, did another year, and then applied to all the top business schools and ended up going to Wharton Business School. Part of the reason being not only had they been ranked top #1 business school over Harvard for like 3 or 4 years, just in those years, they'd always been #2 for like 30 years.
Yeah.
They had just won top ranked business school and they just overtaken Harvard, but also because the alumni database, I'm all about relationships. I'm like, gosh, I can already plug into the Harvard database.
Right.
Wouldn't it be great to plug into the second biggest database in history,
Right.
which is Wharton?
Right.
And they had a program called the Lauder Institute, started by Estee Lauder, the founder, the Leonard Lauder, and Ronald Lauder. Those guys, when they were in the 70s and 80s, they couldn't find enough international minded executives to put it all over the world. So they were looking for MBA students who were smart. So they got into Wharton, who spoke at least 3 languages and had worked outside their home countries.
Okay.
Because then they funded this program called the Lauder Institute. It was a Master in International Studies. They could just go and recruit there.
Right.
for the Lauder Institute around the world, but then also
Right.
all the other international organizations could also just recruit there. And at the time, and I think for 20, 30 years, it made sense. Now it still exists, but today you have amazing Chinese people who are just as smart as Americans. And I don't think a Chinese company is going to hire an American who speaks Chinese. Same with, maybe a French company or a German or a Japanese or a Brazilian. So I'm not sure the relevance of it anymore, but it was pretty cool because everyone was the most international business-minded human being you could imagine. And
Yeah.
my languages obviously were Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian.
Yeah.
I ended up learning after business school French, though, working. We'll get to that. But yeah, so now I speak 5 languages, including English, like English.
Wow. So you graduate with your master's, right?
Yep.
In international studies?
International studies from the Lauder Institute, and then strategy and finance from the Wharton School, because it's 2 different degrees.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah,
So
because you start 6 months, you start 6 months early,
Yeah.
and then every day you do 4 hours extra of coursework. So the business schools from 8 a.m. to 2, and from 2 to 6, it's the master's in international studies.
And why does this not surprise me? Right?
Yeah, well, the good news is, I think Wharton by then had decided to do pass fail, so there wasn't a stress like there was at Harvard to kind of get great grades. And so it was hard. You worked because you could still fail. Like I did fail 1 class. I had to retake it. So it's not something you want to do. It was accounting, actually. A lot of people
Right.
failed that class.
Yeah, I didn't like accounting either. So you graduate with 2 degrees, right? One from the Lauder Institute, one from Wharton. And now you go where?
From there, I go to, I got a call the last semester of business school from a guy who told me he was the CEO of Puma. And I thought it was actually my roommate, joking, because he had a really funny, thick German accent. So I would go over to my roommate's room, a guy named Jesse Stein, and I opened the door to see if he's, fooling around with me, right?
On the phone? Yeah.
On the phone, and he's totally asleep. And I'm thinking, wait a second, is this really the CEO of Puma, the
Right.
sneaker company?
Right.
So turns out it was.
You thought you were being punked.
Yeah, I thought I was being punked completely. And it's not every day a CEO of a major company. Well, so here's the interesting. So in the summers, you do a summer internship. I worked at Reebok, and I worked for Paul Fireman, the CEO of Reebok.
Yeah.
And I helped build Reebok Soccer, right? It ended up being a failure because even though we invested tons of money, we hired like 20 people. Paul Fireman didn't realize he'd have to compete with Nike, who had just gotten into soccer in 1997-8. And so he ended up pulling the plug. I was like, I'm not going to go work for Reebok now that they're not going to really invest in Reebok Soccer.
Right.
So, but then my work was noticed in the industry because it's a small industry, the sports world.
Yeah.
And so the CEO of Puma calls me and says, look, I'm 35. He goes, the CEO, I'm 35 years old. I'm Jochen Zeitz. And he had the thick accent, and I'm the youngest CEO in German history in the stock exchange. I just took Puma from bankrupt. We just made money, and I need someone to kind of be like the president, chief operating officer, head of brand. I need a Procter & Gamble guy like you to come in, hire 5 to 10 other Procter & Gamble people, and relaunch Puma now that we have money. And so he goes, but I can't pay you. I'm going to pay you literally half of what an MBA makes. And but you will live in great hotels. You're going to be flying to a different country, because Puma was only 300 employees. It had gone down from 14,000 when they were bankrupt to 300. And they only were 4 countries. Okay.
So they were on a shoe string. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.